In the structure of what we're doing, every 12 weeks, we put a space. This space is necessary for articulation. In days before television, which were days before computers, but in days before television even, when print was still the medium, one went to a kind of a linotype machine to make print. But in days before the linotype machine, 100 years ago, people had to set type. And in setting type, you held a little tray in your hand that held usually a paragraph. And you had before you a font. And each letter was on a piece of lead about the size of a little fingernail. And you got very good at setting type. And you placed letters next to each other in order to make a word. If you had a simple word like to, T-O, you put the T and the O next to each other. But in order to articulate the letters so that you could make words, there was a box next to the E, because E is the most used letter in the English language in type. And next to the E were blanks, just pieces of lead that had no letter at all. And you put those blanks at the end of each word so that the next word would begin just a little space over. Those blanks were like the foundation of all the other letters and are like the Tao. The Tao is a blank which allows for articulation, without which language would be incomprehensible, without which action would be meaningless. And so these blanks, these spaces, these 0 bits are the insurance of usefulness. They're the guarantee of workability and practical qualities. And so Tao comes into play with the practical quality of doing. And the ancient Greek word for that was pragmatos, which we get the word that William James popularized in an essay and John Dewey developed into a philosophy, and it became known as the American School of Philosophy, pragmatism. But before Dewey and before William James, the great figure who developed the intellectual theory, the logical understanding of order that allowed for pragmatism to happen was Charles Sanders Peirce. And Peirce's most famous book was called Values in a Universe of Chance. And that might be the subtitle, the perfect American subtitle for the I Ching, Values in a Universe of Chance. Because when there is chance, there is a randomness. But when there are values, randomness transforms to change. And instead of chance, you have change. And so valuation, which denotes meaning, transforms chance to change. And all of it is secured as real because the doing happens, because the pragmatic action occurs. So that the whole notion of a logic, of an order, the entire idea of a system, of an ecology, of a pattern, a cycle. The entire notion of a logic is founded upon a tacit, that is a non-spoken, a tacit assumption. And that is something is happening. So that the doing of whatever it is, the action, in language we call this the verbs. The verbs ensure that meaning is occurring. If you have a language, if it were possible to have a language where there were only nouns, the nouns would regress naturally back to guttural vowels, which would be replaced by gesture. One finds this, for instance, in feral children. Children who are cases where they have been raised without language. And if a child is raised without language by the age of 9, they never are able to learn a language. The complexity of a language is so sophisticated that by trying to figure it out using a conscious, differential, analytical mind, it is impossible to do so because it is too complex to comprehend. So the achievement of the use of a language is what we would call precognitive. Or if you prefer, if you're psychologically oriented, it's subconscious. Which just means to say that it's something that is done before it is thought about. So that doing is a precedent, a necessary precedent for language. And that there can be no order to a language, there can be no logic without an articulate action. So the articulation of action is the most fundamental quality of what we would call real stuff. The bottom line is, what are we doing? It is the motive, it is the vocabulary which generates a grammar which allows for something to be said. In our education, nature, as the first 12 weeks, takes place in a precognitive, pre-language domain, which is so extensive that no definition can be given to it. And so we used a handy phrase that nature is a matrix of change. Now we're going to talk about the Tao Te Ching today, which is going to be our first little spacer. The Tao Te Ching, this talk, is the space in between nature as a 12-week area of investigation, commencing our education, and the next 12-week section, which is ritual, which concerns doing. And ritual will concern existence. And we will see after a second spacing, there'll be a third section called myth, which deals with language. And then there'll be a third spacing, and there'll be a fourth section that deals with symbol. And yet a fourth spacing, and then there'll be a fifth 12-week section that is now called vision, but used to be called magic. The ancient name for it was magic. Now, one of the curious principles about order is that when a cyclic order, when a circle of order is established, there is a double coordinate that comes into play without anyone intending it to, without anyone forcing it to, it does come into play. Because a cycle or a circle of learning falls into a pattern of fourness naturally, we would say. And the fourness is not in the quality of 1, 2, 3, 4, but in the pattern of a pair of pairs. So that if you were to abstract out the essence of the order of a circle, it would be pairedness. But so deep would pairedness be that all pairs in themselves pair off and create quaternities, fournesses. And so a square is a symbol of wholeness related directly to what a circle establishes, so that the circle and the square together are symbols of wholeness. They're not only international symbols of wholeness, they are universal symbols of wholeness. You could be on the glorious 12th planet of the main sequence star Altair, waiting for some supply ship to come in from some other star system. And for you, circles and squares would be signs of wholeness, just like we here on this particular planet around this particular star. Is universal. It always is established because that's the way it happens. So when we keep asking like children, why, the ultimate answer is that that's the way it happens. That's the way it occurs. Now the Tao Te Ching is the Chinese way of understanding the way things happen. It's the Chinese version of the Roman book that we alluded to at the very beginning of Nature, the Roman book entitled in Latin, De Rerum Natura. Lucretius, the great Roman poet, physicist at about 50 BC, contemporary of Cicero, who had mastered and studied under many fine teachers, including Posidonius, the greatest of all the Stoic teachers. The way things are. What's important is for us to be able to bring in language and terms from other areas of the world, because we are not Chinese, we are not Romans, and we're trying to, in a very large way, be planetary. And so I'd like to bring in two words from Sanskrit logic, two words that were placed together for all time in the 13th century in India. It was a very great age of reconnaissance, of intelligence, of trying to figure out what is real. And at that time, there was a huge, voluminous set of books on logic written, which stands as one of the greatest logical treatises ever written by human beings. Its name has to do with the word for jewel. And it's called the Tattva Sintamani. And the essence of the Tattva Sintamani is a brilliance, arrayed brilliance of logical insight. And I'll give you the word after the break. And I'll say something about the word and about its esoteric nature. But the two words from the Tattva Sintamani that I want to bring in are two terms that together were resolved by the greatest yogis on the planet as establishing the actuality of causality. That cause and effect does occur, but it does not occur in the naive way that a lot of Western thought has presumed. Not just assumed, but presumed. And someone who was a master of Indian logic, of the Tatya Sinamani, could have taken intellectual shears to Descartes and cut little paper dolls like a fat little French boy who really didn't understand that he was just playing and really wasn't at all mature enough intellectually to understand what a real logic does. The two words I want to bring out of the Tattva Sintamani are Anvaya, A-N-V-A-Y-A, Anvaya, and Vyatirika, V-Y-A-T-I-R-E-K-E. Anvaya is the key term. Anvaya in Sanskrit logic means co-presence. Some of you have heard me speak about shared presence teachers. Well, this is part of the planetary underpinning of that great idea that will dominate the next 200 or 300 years of world civilization. The logical underpinning in yogic logic is that there are a pair of principles that always happen, and because they always happen together, establish causality. Establish causality as something that actually does occur. It actually manifests, but that its occurrence floats upon nothing. That things are real in the fact that they are like pieces of cork. They really are pieces of cork, but that those pieces of cork float upon an ocean of notness. Not K-N-O-T, but N-O-T. That things are real because they float on an ocean of no thing. And were they not to float upon an ocean of no thing, they could not be things. Because it is only the substrate of the no thing that guarantees the articulation necessary for things to be real. And that causality has to do not with this hitting that and that happening. That cause and effect is absolutely, excuse me, asinine. That's not causality at all. That's a pool game. That's billiard parlor spiel. Causality is founded logically upon the precision of anvaya, co-presence. Co-presence. And co-presence is a pair with co-absence. Because co-presence and co-absence always occur together. It's like yin and yang in Lao Tzu. There is no yang by itself. There is no isolated yang whatsoever. And to say that this piece of fruit is yang and this piece of fruit is yin is rather Cartesianly speaking a misapprehension, to be polite. We have other words for it. I won't utter them. You know them. Anvaya, co-presence, indicates that cause-effect is a polarity which occurs in manifestation because there is a related wholeness which is precedent to it, but that the related wholeness which is precedent to it does not maintain its place, but gives way automatically, as it were, to things. So that form can only be form because the space that is the context within which form articulately occurs doesn't interfere with its occurring. If the background got in the way, there would be no forms because it would be impossible to have them articulated. So that, for instance, when you're teaching novices sculpture, you're always getting to a certain point of resistance where the novice sculptor has become very good at dealing with the forms, and they pay all their attention to the forms, and as a good art teacher, not that you're teaching the art, but you're teaching the atmosphere within which the young artist can realize what's happening, the question one asks them in sort of asides as not to embarrass them too much or not confront them in an egotistical way because they have pride that they know how to make these forms, but you ask them, what about the space that it's existing in? This is a very interesting form, but it's not vibrating in its space. It's not creating space. Because the art of sculpture is that the space surrounding the sculpture becomes a co-present with the form, and that's the art of sculpture. If a sculpture doesn't ring, please take a seat. If the sculpture doesn't ring in the space in which it inhabits, it's not art. It's just craft. And I don't say just craft to demean the craftsman, but it is craft and not art. So that the form and its background are co-present. If the background is absent, logically, the form also is absent. This is extremely difficult to apprehend. And human beings in their egotistical myopia are bullish and dogged and resistant about this. They don't want to know this because it discloses to their ego on the most fundamental level that the ego doesn't exist because it doesn't recognize the universal openness which is co-present with it. It's threatened by that. So there's a crisis of existence which art discloses. And that's why art has everything to do with the person, with the personal. But we can't even get to art until we go through an ecology which begins in nature and makes its first transformation to ritual. And so this lecture today uses the Tao Te Ching as an articulate spacing to show how the zero base becomes one. To put it more simply, how does zero get to be one? It's the greatest mystery that there is in reality. How do you get one when there was nothing? The Tao Te Ching, in its title, Tao Te Ching. Ching simply means book here. Classic book. Tao Te, 0, 1. Tao is 0, Te is 1. Oneness. Here's how the 11th chapter of the Tao Te Ching reads in this translation here by Victor Mayer. 30 spokes converge on a single hub, but it is in the space where there is nothing that the usefulness of the cart lies. Clay is molded to make a pot, but it is in the space where there is nothing that the usefulness of the clay pot lies. Cut out doors and windows to make a room, but it is the spaces where there is nothing that the usefulness of the room lies. Therefore, benefit may be derived from something, but it is in nothing that we find usefulness. Now, this is very, very, very difficult. It's difficult to approach. It's difficult to find some way I think I would like to present to you my translation of this and see how this sounds to you. My translation of this particular chapter, chapter 11, its title in Chinese, because titles were given to it somewhere around the time of Wang Pei, which was about the 2nd century AD. His title for this were 2 characters. The first Chinese character meant use, and the character that then followed it, under it, because Chinese characters are written down, it has use, and then the next is non. And it reads, actually then, in Chinese, non-use. Non-use. 3 times 10 spokes unite in one hub. You can see that in Lao Tzu, unlike the most excellent English translation here by Victor Mayer, but he misses a kind of a Pythagorean articulateness which is essential for intelligence to be logically precise about why it is so. 3 times 10. 10 is a 1 and a 0 together. They're very symbolic. 3 times 10 spokes unite in one hub. They integrate in oneness. The hub is the oneness. The oneness is the te. The te of a wheel is that all the spokes come together in a single hub. And the only way to keep the spokes together in a single hub is to have a resonant rim which recircles like the hub does on the inside, circles the outside. So that the wheel, here in Lao Tzu, but even more profoundly in Indian thought, the wheel is the symbol of Dharma. And so Dharma is always put together, just like the 2 Chinese words that read non-use. The 2 Sanskrit words that really go together for all time are Dharma Chakra, truth wheel, Dharma Chakra. When the Buddha began to teach, he didn't say he was going out to teach. He wasn't going out to make a buck. He wasn't going out to spiel, to have conferences here and there. But he was turning the Dharma Chakra. The earliest Taoist symbol of primacy in its activeness is the mythological character Pan Ku, who holds a Tai Chi symbol just like as if it were a Dharma Chakra and is turning it. I'll show an illustration one of these times to you. A wheel is real only when it turns. A wheel that is in stasis disappears from its wheelness and becomes an abstract pattern, and reads visually as a pattern, as a mandala, but not as a wheel. The mandala is different from a wheel. The mandala is a decommissioned wheel. Now, when you have a Cartesian basis to your psychology, you see in your mind at certain points mandalas, like Uncle Carl Jung, and maybe 8 million other psychiatrists who try to get mandalas out of their patients and get them to draw them. And they say, this is a good sign. Whereas somebody who really knows truth is shocked when someone pulls a dead abstract image out of a living psyche, because it shows that the psyche is no longer connected with life, but has accepted a projection from the therapist, Because there's no way in a living psyche that you don't get a wheel. In one of the most accurate prophets who ever lived on the planet, Ezekiel, when he stressed himself to the exclamation mark in his intensity, in his fervor, to experience what was real, he saw wheels within wheels, way up in the sky. Oh yeah, that's what you see. You see the whirling cosmos in its wheel-like dynamic. You never see a mandala. And all that one can do is hope that the therapists around the planet who see mandalas in their mind might consider going back to school. Chapter 11 reads, 3 times 10 spokes unite in one hub through its non. There, the wheel itself's utilization. Through its non. The Chinese character that's here is exactly the same character as in the title, non-use. In its non, there. The Chinese character means there. It's like a key, here. There, in the non, the wheel itself's utilization. So my translation, different from this one. This one reads, 30 spokes converge on a single hub, but it is in the space where there is nothing that the usefulness of the cart lies. Doesn't quite get the vibrant, wheel-like dynamic. This is nice sketch, mandala-based. This has the Dharma chakra, because we're at a stage where we need to have the Dharma chakra, because the nice diagrams are not going to get us off the planet. You can't go back to the moon. You can't go to Mars. You can't go to any other star system with just photographs. You have to have a dynamic, multidimensional, living reality to go. 3 times 10 spokes unite in one hub through its non, there, the wheel itself's utilization. Handling clay, thereby done the bowl through its non, there, the world itself's utilization. Cutting out doors, windows, thereby done the room through its non, there, the room itself's utilization. It's like Frank Lloyd Wright's famous dictum, the space of a room is its reality. And an architecture concerns itself with the continuity of the space, because that's where human spirit occurs, because space and spirit are consonant. The word spaceman is archetypal. It doesn't mean a toy. It's like the co-presence, the anvaya of what is really true about us. To finish up chapter 11, Lao Tzu, in my translation, after he's talking about the wheel, after he's talking about the clay pot, after he's talking about the room, it's like a meditation, right? One is in a meditation and one sees the wheel in one's spirit. And then one notices the teapot, which is in where one is meditating, and then one notices the room. So it's like Lao Tzu is saying to us that he found this while being in his room, while drinking some tea out of a clay pot, while experiencing the Ezekiel-like wheel within. He realized that non-use was Tao. And so he brings us to a conclusion, and the Chinese character reads, just like in a logic text, Just like in a philosophic book, the word means therefore. It's just like in geometry, where you have the axioms and you have the basic statements, and then you have the three little dots that symbolize in geometry, therefore. Therefore, the there itself, thereby done. Therefore, the there itself, thereby done, the beneficial. Non itself, thereby done, utilization. So that the pair is beneficial, utilization. The benefit is in the thing, the utilization is in the non-thing. Because it's the non-background that allows for the thing to affect other things. And if it couldn't affect other things, nothing would happen. So that action is real only because reality is zero-based. And things are one, floating in it. If they weren't, there would be no mobility. So that one would like to say this. Nature has a zero base. Ritual has a oneness base. And out of that interplay comes a resonance which records as two, but two which are linked together indissolubly in an angle of vision. So that the third level, you have Tao, 0, Te, 1, and the third is Gen, human-heartedness, us. And though we occur as a third, our valuation is really a 2, but it's a 2 in the sense of a pair. Not a 2 in the sense of duality. Not a 2 in the sense of couple. No partnerships here. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the geometry of existence. And in the geometry of existence, the order runs 0, 1, pair. And pairedness in Lao Tzu, in Chinese thought, is human-heartedness. Which is why human-heartedness is brought out pristinely when two human beings are together, because they form a pair of pairs, which is very stable, but the two of them together are a primordial pair of human-heartedness. So human-heartedness has a built-in, implicit relationality, so that one can say that there is always a kind of a relational quality to wholeness, and that pairedness is where it occurs first. So that while existence occurs in one, experience occurs in pairedness. There is no experience without pairedness at all. None at all. This is why one in very, very sophisticated meditations, and there must be several hundred meditations that are capable now, by this time in the history of this particular planet, that can establish that you can conflate experience so that it becomes single-focused. Single-focused. Only oneness occurs. And when that occurs, there is a counter movement that happens all by itself, where the oneness blanks out into the zero base. And the oneness blanks back in out of the zero base into its oneness. And that is like a tuning fork, which when it vibrates, one realizes that the one is actually a pair, and that's where the vibration comes in. The articulation of vibration is because pairedness is as real as it is because it is founded upon the Te, the oneness. And the Te is real because it is founded upon the Tao, the zero base. So that the integrity of relatedness, of co-presence, is always paired with co-absence. Vayatarika. Notice here that the two, the pairedness and the zero, are related together as a pair surrounding the one. So I invented a phrase to account for this so that somebody could get it completely. I called it grandfather phasing, or if you like, grandmother phasing. That wisdom is always based on the fact that the first stage, the Tao, is co-resonant with the second stage, the Gen, the human-heartedness. The human-heartedness in its reality fits with the Tao so perfectly that they form a phase which becomes consonant. Not just becomes consonant, but is always consonant. Musical fact. If you have a room full of violins, and you pick up one of the violins, and you play a middle C on that violin, every other violin in the room will resonate to middle C, though there is no one there playing those violins. You play all of the violins in the room. You play all of the violins in the world if they were within vibrational distance of that middle C. This is the whole principle of salvation. All salvation happens because there only need be one Savior who needs just say one word really once. And its vibration does everything forever, completely. As someone once wrote on a wall in Hollywood, don't worry, it's 100% out of your hands. Let's take a break. The 36th chapter of the Tao Te Ching is entitled Secret Words. Secret Words. In my translation, it reads like this: that which desires to contract itself surely, definitely has stretched itself. That which desires to weaken itself surely, definitely has strengthened itself. That which desires to bring down itself surely, definitely has raised itself. That which desires to reduce itself surely, definitely has endowed itself. This is called secret words. Receptively weak conquers the unbending strong. Fish cannot escape their depths. Country itself's sharp tools cannot thereby be shown to Jen. Now sometimes this last line is translated as the state's sharp weapons should not be shown to the people. As if this was like nice, homey, Cracker Barrel wisdom. That people are going to be nice and quiet if you don't show them the power that the state has. The state's sharp weapons should not be shown to the people. That they're going to get ideas of something. All these AK-8000s that'll be coming out with 4 million rounds per second. Well, that's not it at all. That kind of Cracker Barrel, folksy wisdom has nothing to do with Lao Tzu, who's one of the greatest of all of the sages of this particular planet. He means to say, country itself's sharp tools not can thereby be shown to Jen. That is to say, the deep wisdom of this is that those tools in that country are consonances of Jen and not something separate which could be displayed as being other than your reality. This is extremely difficult for someone who is blocky to understand. Someone who is bullheaded will not understand this. This is why I introduced the two Sanskrit terms, meaning co-presence and co-absence, because they illuminate. It's an angle of vision that I'm bringing in, a kind of a syncretism, if you like, but an angle of vision from India to highlight. Because by the 13th century in India, there was already a lot of exchange and interchange between India and China. And just like Buddhism went from India to China, Taoism went from China to India. And in the days before racist charges excised it from children's literature, there used to be a fairy tale called Little Black Sambo, where he got treed by a tiger. And then the tiger chased its own tail around the base of the tree so fast that it turned into butter. And Little Black Sambo was able to come down and eat in peace, having a little butter on his food. It's a vignette of the way in which the optimum speed of illusion dissolves it into reality. One of Salvador Dali's greatest paintings is the maximum speed of Raphael's Madonna. Co-presence and co-absence are a pair. They occur together, always. So that relational wholeness, when it's in its mode as cause-effect polarity, is there because it has precipitated out of the complementarity. Yin-yang only work because they have precipitated out of Tao, and they precipitate out of Tao not as yin, not as yang, but as yin-yang. And that action by which they do so, and thus yin-yang co-presently establish the te of things, is the way in which zero becomes one. This is extremely important. But as soon as there is one has its own dynamic of bringing into play the fourness, the quaternary. As soon as the one, which comes in not so much just as a one, it's like there's an optical illusion. Think of the one as this finger. Here's a one. And when it vibrates as zero. But not as zero invisible, but as zero as the circle. So that the wholeness of one is the circle. And the abstract structure, which allows for the stability of the circle, is in its squared quality. Squaring the circle was always the most esoteric of all the geometric functions in Western history. How could you tell a real magus from some pretender? Because they can square a circle. In China, the esoteric Taoist phrase, used especially by the Maoshan Taoists outside of Nanjing some 1500 years ago, was that you could always tell a Taoist master because you could look in his eyes and he would have square pupils. Because one does not have square pupils in terms of a deformed retina, but one has squared pupils because one sees the fourfold root of the world. In fact, reading that early literature in the Indian version, the Upanishadic commentary version, allowed for one of the great Western German philosophers, Schopenhauer, to write a book called The Fourfold Principle of the World, one of the great works of Western philosophy. All of this is to say that you can weave wisdom back and forth, and if you realize that these terms that I brought in to illuminate the Tao Te Ching come from 13th century India, it's a 13th century India that has exchanged with China for over many thousands of years, so that there was a blending together, a marrying of flavors. A quality was able to come out. And of course, just as in India, one had this precise logic at this time in the 13th century, a couple of generations later, you had the migration of this precise logic edge back into China, and it edged back into China this time over the Himalayas and went first to Tibet. And so in Tibet in the 14th century, you had the precision of someone like a Tsongkhapa, who founded the Gelugpa order, of which the Dalai Lama is the head. And their pride of place in the Tibetan world is that they are consummate logicians. To train oneself in the Gelugpa sect, you must be able to recite the pro and con of fantastically complex arguments from start to finish with equal authority and balance, so that the pros and cons spread almost like mental wings of a butterfly and are able to free one because they are now wings and not opposites. This is the freeing aspect. This is the spirit-freeing quality. And so if one were able to really appreciate, for instance, the Dalai Lama today, he is the best debater in the whole Vajrayana, because his logical preciseness is just coolly perfect. That he's not had that brought into play by people who interview him or who want to talk with him and so forth. He is just a defect of people who don't understand who he is and what he is. And the founder of the Gelugpa order, Tsongkhapa, is always identified by his yellow hat. And it was a revision of the whole Vajrayana that had become too concerned with magical efficacy and had not paid attention to the logical order that is necessarily there in magic. Because logic and magic are co-present in the quaternal wholeness of a truth. Wherever truth occurs, one of the quarters is always logic, one of the quarters is always magic. One of the charming little books by one of the greatest precise thinkers of our age was Bertrand Russell. He wrote a little book called Logic and Mysticism. And if you like to look at it sometime, it's very interesting to see how it plays. But even more precise than logic and mysticism is a little book called Authority and the Individual. And Authority in the Individual by Bertrand Russell is very much like the Tao Te Ching. It is a precise logical tour of why freedom is absolutely necessary. For instance, you could read Authority in the Individual by reading the topic sentence of every paragraph. You don't have to read the whole book. Just read the topic sentence of every paragraph, and the argument runs clean all the way through to opening. By the time Lord Russell was able to write that, he was one of the most precise thinkers in world history. Don't forget that he and Whitehead wrote Principia Mathematica in 3 great volumes, which proved, for once and for all, in discursive language, that the forms of higher mathematics are exactly congruent with the forms of logical discourse. They are the same. They were always approached from different sides. They were shown conclusively to be together. One might just venture this, that in 13th century India, they had a Principia Mathematica, the Tatya Sintamani, and out of that, a century later, came the Gelugpa order, and a century later in China, as it went up, you got a genius like Wang Yangming, who completely revised, by bringing together in a new formulation, the entire history of Chinese thought. We, with a convenient way, look at Confucius and Lao Tzu, but a really educated Chinese person will always look at Wang Yangming. Let me say this, and we'll get to the Tao Te Ching and open it up a little bit so you can have some appreciation here. A logic, an order, a system, an ecology, a pattern, a cycle, a symbol, are always a relational wholeness which eventually becomes existence. And the way it becomes existence is that something is done, and the first step of doing is what we would call ritual, and that the codification of the effectiveness of ritual is summed up in a word, numeracy. Numeracy, and the dictum is this: numeracy precedes literacy. People learn to count before they learn to write. Numbers are written before words are written. Numeracy precedes literacy, just as ritual precedes myth. When ritual gets its dynamic together, it flames into language. Language is the fire in the wood of ritual. Words come out because ritual is happening. And that's why from the masked dance come those root syllables. Ha, hey, ho, ha, ah, eh, ah, oh. The vowels come from the flaming of rhythmic motion into language. Root syllables like om or ah have denotive power. As my great artist friend Jan Isaac Sather calls them anchor points. The essential element of a composition can be read by its anchor points. Just like the essential point of a language expression can be read by its root syllables. And if you know the root syllables, you can see the seeds whose ripples are the meaning of the text, the meaning of the written, the meaning of the spoken. If you can hear the root symbols accurately, articulately, then their vibration is the language that comes into play. Suffixes, prefixes, tenses have a connotative power. The denotative power is in the root syllables. The connotative power is in the prefixes and the suffixes, in the tenses. Past, present, future, future perfect. So that the more tenses that are available, the more time tensing available to a verbal mode, and the more prefixes and suffixes available to a nominal mode, the more consonance there is, the more consonant action that there is, the more power, connotative power there is to a language. And that consonance founds definition. Consonance founds definition. So that boundaries, the boundary of what something means, what does this word mean? What is the definition of this word? It is the boundary which is formed by its consonance, which is a connotation from the striking of its root syllable, by the action of comprehension. So that action, pragmatos, makes existence occur, and out of existence comes experience in just this way. And experience is always detectable, it's tasteable, because there's a language operative. And whenever one tastes language operating, you know that existence has been vibrantly put into play. The whole drama of a Greek tragedy is that in this half circle, this semicircle, which is the stage, and the other semicircle, which is the audience, those two halves sit in a silence, and the first thing that happens is that a figure moves onto the stage, and as soon as they do, the stage becomes articulately different from the audience who sit unmoving. Unlike in the very first Greek tragedy that Aeschylus made called The Persians, as soon as the first word is spoken, it is a relentless unfolding of a form which is so archetypally precise that there is no way that it could not happen exactly as it does. And to witness that this is the pristine way, once language comes into play, once experience is evoked, unless you do something consciously to modify it, it will run a course relentlessly, accurately. And that's the tragedy. The tragedy is that without a modifying consciousness, like a rudder, to steer a course and navigate, as soon as we say anything, a relentless skit is put into play that sweeps everything along, regardless of what you're hoping for. A Greek tragedy shows that you better not cross your fingers and hope, but that you better take conscious motion and steer clear of the shoals of automatic unfoldment. And you can't ask the gods to do it for you. You can't ask someone else to do it for you. You have to do it. Because otherwise it's a flaw on the basis of existence. Your existence. And one of the worst cries ever heard on this planet is the cry of that discovery of someone like an Oedipus in Sophocles. Ah! It's a belated cry of recognition that there's no way that this automatic unfolding does not occur. So that the power of respect in ritual to make sure you're doing it right is to safeguard against this autonomic unfoldment that will happen relentlessly. And if you do the ritual exactly right, and it is guided in its rhythmic doing by a language which ensures that it's being steered to the right purpose, then you are secure. It is very dangerous, it is perilous, it is radioactive not to pay attention to detail in ritual. Because all you have to do is miss one aspect, and in that nick, For the want of a nail, a shoe was lost. For the want of a shoe, a horse was lost. For the want of a horse, a battle was lost. For the want of a battle, a kingdom was lost. And so, primordial man, not very primitive, not very superstitious, but very accurate, kept track of doing things the right way. Now, when you make and bring your mask of food next week, when you bring your mask of food, that mask is the spirit of that food. It's the spirit of that food to be used in a ritual way. That mask is a ritual implement meant to ensure that that food will be folded into the right play of its nature, the right rhythm of its existence will record, so that when you hold that mask of that food up to your face, an indelible thusness will occur. In Lao Tzu, that thusness is called Tzu-Jan. 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 It means self-sowness. Self-sow. Notice the vibrant pairing. Self-sow. Ness. In Sanskrit, it's called tathata, thusness. The co-presence with tathata in Sanskrit is shunyata, the void. Thusness and void are co-present, and they are co-absent. Not codependent. Not talking about that. Co-present, co-absent. Tzu-Jan is co-present with Tao. Wherever Tao occurs, self-sowness occurs. So that there never was an abstract Tao without someone who was self-sow with it. A lot of Western thinkers, two-bit, tin-horn, third-hand, fourth raters, are passing around to disciples and everyone else the sense that somehow there's a big bank up in the sky where an abstract Tao occurs, and we got to get to it. We got to open a checking account there. No, sir, brothers and sisters. Not so. Without someone who is self-sow, Tao does not occur. So that the Chinese have a very precise way of saying this when they're masterful about their own tradition. That it has something to do with man and nature. When you ask a really wise Chinese Taoist sage, what is Tao? They will say to you with a very polite, perhaps a quirky smile, it has something to do with man and nature. And you have to hear in that until there is someone who is self-sow, Tao does not occur. The zero base does not exist. It only comes into existence when someone is self-sow. When Tzu-Jan is operative, Tao is there. It's the grandfather phasing of the two. And when that grandfather phasing is there, the world is also there. The fifth phase is there. Tao in the first phase, the Gen, human-hearted self-sowness in this third phase, and the world of 10,000 things in the fifth phase. And the pivots upon which these fly, the wings which allow for Tao, Tzu-Jan, and the cosmos to occur, are Te and I symbols. And the Te in the symbols are also grandfather phase. The second and the fourth, also grandfather phase. So wherever there is Te, there are symbols. So that one has to back a little bit away and see that a structure forms all by itself. As soon as there is a one, a fourness is present. What fourness? As soon as there is action, which denotes existence, you not only have existence, as in ritual, but you have myth, you have symbol, and you have the fourth filling up the quaternity, because zero, nature is zero-based. It doesn't compute into the circle as a part of it. You have a fourth quality that comes into play that in ancient times was called magic. Ritual, myth, symbol, magic are the primordial quaternity. It's better to use the term vision in our day. A lot of people shy away from magic, or think of two-bit parlor people like Crowley or things like that. You know, Yeats threw Crowley out of the Order of the Golden Dawn. He said, mystery schools are not reform schools. We don't need over-aged juvenile delinquents. Magic, or vision, is the numinous. The numinous. The numinous world that is real because someone has done something. If you want to keep it in the ends, to the nth degree, I'm playing with words, ritual is numeracy, myth is nameability, symbols is noesis, noetic, and the realm of vision is numinous. Numeracy, nameability, noesis, numinous. And because this quaternity, this five-phase energy cycle, nature as the beginning, but zero-based, then ritual, then myth, then symbol, then vision. Because these four, ritual, myth, symbol, vision, because they form a whole, and yet they're not the whole story, because zero is the basis upon which this form floats. The zero allows for these four to move in a rotation, in a sequential rotation, and as they do, ritual tends to drop out and some new thing comes into play. And as ritual drops out, art comes into play. Ritual transforms into art so that the new quaternary, the new stability, is myth, symbol, vision, art. This is the secret way in which the artist creates a new dimension of reality, by transforming ritual into art. Lao Tzu is one of the world's greatest artists. Let's listen to a little bit of Lao Tzu. I have a translation here, chapter 38. This is the translation by Robert Hendricks. The highest virtue is not virtuous. Therefore, it truly has virtue. The lowest virtue never loses sight of its virtue. Therefore, it has no true virtue. Look how it sounds mysterious at first. The highest virtue is not virtuous. Therefore, it truly has virtue. The lowest virtue never loses sight of its virtue, therefore it has no true virtue. If you're keeping track, if you're forcing objectivity on virtue, it's not happening. Because the Chinese term for virtue is te. Te occurs because you're not keeping track of it, because it is a wholeness of oneness. If you're keeping track of it, it isn't oneness, but some fraction of it. And when it's fractionated, there's no wholeness. You cannot have it both ways. So that the Taoist moves with wholeness that is not kept track of, and that's called Wu Wei. Non-doing. Doing by non-doing. Let's try my translation here, and let's see if we can hear it in a different way. This is my translation of 38. Superior Te is not Te, therefore Te occurs. Shang Te, superior Te, is not, quote, identified, because to identify something, you have to bring it into a proportional relationality, a fractionization of it. And when you fractionate it, it is infinitely fractionable. This is the whole principle in chaos theory. This is why fractals go forever. Fractals fracture into infinity. And they do so because it is logically true. They should. The only thing that does not fractionate into infinity is wholeness. Wholeness is always what it is and cannot be identified by any other way than simply living it. You have to live wholeness, otherwise it isn't whole. It doesn't happen. Superior Te is not Te, therefore Te occurs. Inferior Te never loses Te, therefore no Te occurs. Superior Te is a resonance action, and nothing thereby causally acts. It doesn't act because this does that, but because this and that are co-present. That's why something happens. If they were not co-present, nothing would happen. There would be no articulateness whatsoever. Because to get this hand, to strike this hand in some kind of a sandbox idea of causality, this hitting that causes this to do that. That is logically impossible. That cannot happen. That is truly nonsensical. And anyone who believes that has a clouded mind. That never happens, has never happened. There is no articulateness in that whatsoever. So Lao Tzu writes, superior Te is a resonance action, and nothing thereby causal acts. Inferior Te acts as itself and has thereby a pretending action. This hitting that as some idea of causality is a pretense. In yoga, it's called an illusion. And the false, flawed bifurcation, not a polarity, but a bifurcation that comes out in philosophical prejudice, is that someone who says that this actually happens and that's the basis of reality is called a realist, and someone who only says that that happens and that doesn't really happen but only says it is called a nominalist. And in Western thought, realists and nominalists argued for 1,000 years and never came to any agreement, because it is fractally impossible for them to come to any agreement. There is no wholeness to be found ever in that activity. It is relentlessly imperfect. So that the wisdom is to set that whole plate of rancid spaghetti down and don't eat any of it. It's not good for you. What's good for you is Wu Wei, not doing. Because the not doing brings into play the mysterious motion of zero becoming one. And when you have oneness in what you're doing, in your existence, the human-hearted relationality will be pure. It will set up in deep consonance with the Tao. So Lao Tzu writes, superior Gen acts itself, but no thereby pretendings. Superior righteousness acts itself, but has therein pretensions. Superior propriety acts itself, but when no one responds, itself stretches forth its arm and enforces itself. Thus, losing Tao, there occurs Te, losing Te, there occurs Gen, losing Gen, then there is righteousness, losing righteousness, then there is propriety. Now, proprieties are loyalty and faith exaggerating, and this is the beginning of disorder. Now, someone who knows how to run a real kingdom must know this. This is why one of the most esoteric books in Western history was called Secret of Secrets. I have an English translation done around 1900 by Oxford University Press. It was the secret instruction that Alexander the Great received from Aristotle of how to run a true world of wholeness, the ecumene. And if you don't know how to do that, there's no way in the world that anything real is going to happen. Everything else is just going to be rancid spaghetti, confusion, disorder, and all that comes out of that are further tummy aches and further disorder, further illusion. There is no resolution in that whatsoever. Notice here that there's a 5-phase energy cycle that devolves in Lao Tzu in chapter 38, which is entitled About Te. The 2 Chinese characters read about. This is all about Te. If you lose Tao, then Te occurs as an identifiable thing, not something that's in the participation of the energy cycle, but as something which stands out and is exposed. If you lose Tao, then Te is something which you say, there it is. And when you can say, there it is, it isn't. It isn't real anymore. It's just something which you call that. When you lose Tao, then there then occurs Te. And losing Te, there occurs Gen. Losing Gen, then there is righteousness. Losing righteousness, then is propriety. Now, proprieties are loyalty and faith exaggerated. Why do they exaggerate? To compensate, to make up for all the missing substrate. And that's how illusion is made in this world. It has to exaggerate. It has to compensate. It has to project. Because there's nothing real there. And in its frightenedness makes up fantasies, fictions. And this is the beginning of disorder. Premature knowledge is Tao as its projected flower, and this is the beginning of ignorance. A premature Tao is always the beginning of ignorance. Premature knowledge is Tao as its projected flower. One might say this in colloquial English, as soon as you get this pie in the sky, premature idea of this is the way truth should be, you already are then in a state of ignorance. And that state of ignorance has, just like a Greek tragedy, an unfoldment which is pristine and 12 discernible steps. It happens just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It's called, the Buddha called it pratitya samutpaya, the endless cycle of dependent order, which ignorance entails in its little skit forever. And the only thing you can do is go around faster or slower, where you're still caught in it. It's called the wheel of samsara. That's not a dharma chakra. It's a wheel without a hub. Lao Tzu then writes, therefore, great, amplified man dwells in thusness not abiding in externalities. He dwells in the fruit, not in the expecting of a flowering. Therefore he avoids the other and chooses another. Bring your masks of food next week. The spirit of food. This will be the beginning of a motion of action, a pragmatos, which will last for 12 weeks. And as that goes into play, as you bring your masks in, there are a first pair of books which we need because it's like the outrigger on this canoe because we're going into our first storm. We're going into the storm of existence. One of the first wise machines sent to the moon was called Surveyor, Surveyor 1. And the place where it landed on Luna, that's the name of that body, was called the Ocean of Storms. And it was beautiful. I wrote a wonderful kind of a poem that was read around San Francisco at the time called Surveyor in the Ocean of Storms. And I'll bring it out next week and read it for you. We need a way of getting telemetry back while we're in the throes of the storm of existence. We need to have an ocean of tranquility, some surveyor in an ocean of tranquility to help us. And what we're doing is we're using the method by which nature was disclosed all over again in ritual. So the first pair of books is The Golden Bough by Sir James George Fraser. You can get the one-volume edition in paperback. And paired with it, the great American sage, Black Elk, American Indian sage, his book called The Sacred Pipe, also available in paperback. Black Elk will have 7 rites associated with the calumet, the sacred pipe. And that cycle, that ritual cycle, that sacred cycle, always begins with hebliche, the crying for a vision. Why would crying for a vision begin the cycle of wholeness? Because the crying for a vision is the committing of oneself to the fullness of the circle of that action at the very beginning of it. At the beginning of ritual, one is already committed to the vision, so that the myth and the symbol sandwiched in between the ritual and the vision will have a consonance to it. A consonance which will be discovered in the true, accurate doing of the ritual, letting it flame into language, letting the language interiorize into symbol, and letting the symbol shine as a light that produces vision. Then you have the natural quaternity that education should produce in its first wholeness. Literally, if one does not see in an education, then the cycle has been fictive. You can tell in a flash, you can tell just like that whether someone is educated or not. A doctor of civilization has a litmus test that he can apply just instantly. You can deliver a secret word, root syllable, to anchor the personality, and if there's vision, the other will smile. You can walk around this world for years and not find anyone who smiles anymore at those anchor points. As the Bhagavad Gita says, this is something God will not permit. And that's when he sends Krishna to drive the car.